Chapter 1. Chains Made of Words. The carriage rocked and groaned beneath Albert, its wheels crunching over the frost-bitten gravel of the northern province. The windows were shuttered, the lantern inside dim, casting shadows that carved hollows into his sharp cheekbones. He sat with his back straight despite the cold that crept through the walls. His wrists were free, but it didn't matter. The chains that bound him weren't iron. They were far more suffocating. Political disobedience. That's what the official decree said. A pretty phrase, vague enough to satisfy the public and condemning enough to exile a man from court. But Albert knew the truth. He had seen the king's ledger, the secret funds, the missing sons of noble houses. He'd asked one too many questions in rooms where silence was expected. He had outlived the king's patience, and that meant he was dangerous. The estate appeared as the carriage turned the final bend, a monstrous gray structure carved into a hillside, flanked by naked trees, and wrapped in a stillness that felt almost watchful. The walls were high, the gates closed, and as they opened with a reluctant creak, Albert felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear, not exactly, but something close enough. The driver didn't speak as he climbed down. Neither did the footman who opened the door. But the man waiting at the gate, he did. "You'll follow me." Keegan's voice was the kind that gave commands even when it asked questions. Gravel-thick, deep, and threaded with the kind of authority Albert had once watched entire battalions obey without blinking. Albert stepped down slowly, boots crunching against the gravel. "No welcome party? Not even a fanfare?" Keegan didn't look amused. He wore a black wool coat that cut broad over his chest, a leather belt tight around his waist. His dark blonde hair was shorter than Albert remembered, his face sharper, more hollow beneath the high ridges of his cheekbones. But those green eyes, they hadn't changed. They still wouldn't meet Albert's. "I'm not here to entertain you," Keegan said flatly, turning on his heel. "Let's go." Albert followed, but not before glancing back at the carriage. It was already pulling away, wheels churning dust into the air like a curtain between him and the rest of the world. He was alone now, except for the man who helped ruin him. The inside of the estate was colder than outside. Stone walls, tall ceilings, and furniture that looked barely used. Everything was gray or dark wood, polished clean, stripped of comfort. Keegan walked ahead without pause, each step purposeful. "You'll sleep in the east wing. Meals are taken in the main hall. You'll have access to the library, courtyard, and the gardens. The west wing and the outer gate are locked unless I allow it." Albert let out a dry laugh. "I see. A gilded cage." Keegan didn't respond. He opened a door to a large room, tall windows, a fireplace that hadn't been lit in weeks, a simple bed with plain white sheets. Albert stepped in, surveying it. "Charming." Keegan moved to leave, but Albert's voice stopped him. "Why you?" Keegan turned his head slightly, but still didn't meet his eyes. "I'm the one the Crown trusted to keep you from causing more damage." Albert took a step forward, just one. "Or the one who's already done the most of it." Silence. Then Keegan said, "Dinner is at 8, and closed the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking wasn't loud, but it echoed in Albert's spine like a warning. He didn't eat. He sat by the window, legs curled under him, watching as the sky darkened into velvet. How the estate seemed suspended in time. No voices, no horses, no sound beyond the occasional bird overhead. Even the wind didn't dare howl. A quiet prison was still a prison. Albert turned the memory over in his mind like a blade. The council chamber, the whispers behind closed doors, the day his mentor disappeared, the day Keegan stood before the king, silent, while Albert was dragged from the room. He had screamed. Not for mercy, but for truth. He'd called Keegan a coward then. Now he wondered if the words still applied. That night, sleep evaded him. He rose sometime after midnight, wrapped a cloak around his shoulders, and padded barefoot through the east wing. No guards. No locks from the inside. But the gate, that would be sealed. He didn't need to check. Still, he made his way to the main hall, stepping lightly over creaking floorboards. The fire was out, but there was a warmth in the room. A flicker. Keegan sat in one of the armchairs, legs wide, coat unbuttoned, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked tired, unshaven. There was a scar across the side of his neck that hadn't been there before. Albert leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Insomnia suits you." Keegan didn't flinch. "You always liked sneaking around in the dark." And you always liked watching, didn't you? That got a reaction. Keegan's jaw ticked, his eyes finally meeting Albert's. They held there for a long moment. Storm green and ember dark, tired and furious, and something else. Something unspoken. Albert stepped inside slowly, his tone lower. I never got to ask you. Were you afraid that day, when you let them drag me out? Keegan's voice was quiet. I was following orders. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Albert stopped in front of him, not touching, not threatening, just present, and so alive it must have burned. I thought you were different, he said. You of all people, but maybe I was just naive. You weren't, Keegan said, so softly Albert almost missed it. You were right. I didn't stop them. I didn't speak, and I've regretted it every day since. Albert blinked. That wasn't the answer he expected, but it wasn't forgiveness either. Not yet. He turned and walked out without another word. The next day passed with a suffocating normalcy. Albert explored the library, dusty but extensive. Books in several languages. He caught Keegan watching him once through the open door. When he looked up, Keegan vanished like a ghost. The servants, few, silent, loyal to Keegan, brought meals, lit fires, answered only what they had to. Albert noted everything. How the western wing was always locked. How Keegan checked the outer gate himself each evening. How there were no horses in the stables. No way to leave. No way but through him. Albert sat by the courtyard that evening, fingers tracing the cracks in the stone bench. He was tired of feeling powerless. But he wasn't the same man they tried to break. And Keegan wasn't the untouchable figure he used to be. That night, as the sky turned to twilight, Albert stood by the gates and waited. Keegan arrived without armor or weapon, just his coat, his key ring, and his unreadable expression. Albert watched as he slid the largest key into the heavy lock. It turned with a deep, slow groan. The gate creaked open an inch, and then shut again with a final clang. Keegan turned to him, his voice low. You'll be safe here. Albert's eyes never left his face. From the world? Keegan hesitated. Albert stepped closer. Or from you? Their eyes locked, finally, and the space between them hummed with tension. Not quite violence, not yet tenderness. Something in between, something neither of them had words for. Keegan didn't answer. He just held Albert's gaze for one long, searing moment, then walked away, leaving the key hanging from the gate. Albert didn't pick it up. Not yet. He watched the man disappear down the stone path and whispered, Coward or not, you'll have to face me eventually. The wind carried the words away, and the chains, once invisible, had already begun to break. Chapter 2. 1 room, 2 prisons. The days stretched like spilled ink, slow, inevitable, and staining everything they touched. Albert had learned the layout of the manor within the first 48 hours, not because he wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. The estate was wide but empty, rooms echoing with every footstep, corners thick with silence. The east wing held his quarters and a faded solarium that no longer caught the sun. The west wing remained locked. The halls in between were filled with old portraits of nobility who had long since faded into obscurity, their gazes accusatory, or worse, indifferent. Keegan was always there. Not in his face. Not intruding, but present. When Albert moved, Keegan moved. When he sat in the library, Keegan took the far chair in the corner, thumbing through a book he never seemed to read. When Albert wandered the hallways, Keegan lingered by the stairwell. When Albert opened a window, Keegan looked up from the courtyard. Not a guard. Not exactly. A shadow. It was maddening. Albert began to test the boundaries, not the physical ones, but the emotional. He skipped meals. The staff grew anxious, but said nothing. Keegan noticed. Of course he noticed. But he didn't speak. Albert stopped speaking, too. For 3 full days. Not a word, not a glance. And still Keegan was there, silent, unmovable. Until the 4th morning, when the cold porridge tray was left untouched again, and Keegan's voice thundered through the east wing like a blade through silk. That's enough. Albert looked up from his perch on the windowsill. Oh, the beast speaks. Keegan didn't respond with words. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and seized Albert by the arm, not roughly, but not gently either. Albert stiffened, more startled than afraid. Let go. Keegan didn't. He pulled him out into the hallway, down 2 corridors, and into the grand study. The door slammed shut behind them, and suddenly the room felt much too small for the weight of the air between them. You don't get to play martyr. Keegan growled, releasing his grip as if Albert's skin had burned him. Albert rubbed his arm, but his voice was ice. And you don't get to play savior. I'm trying to keep you alive. No, Albert snapped. You're trying to keep your conscience intact. Silence. Then the fury erupted. Sharp, ragged, and impossible to contain. Albert spoke first, words like knives. You stood there. You didn't speak up. You let them call me a traitor, and now you want me to sit quietly and eat soup like we're guests at a dinner party. Keegan's jaw tightened. I had orders. You had choices. I was protecting. Who? Albert demanded. The king? The crown? Yourself? Keegan stepped closer, eyes blazing. I'm protecting you now. Albert stared up at him, chest rising and falling. Too late. Something cracked between them then. Not bones, not glass. Something deeper. Keegan stepped back, like he'd only just realized how close they were. His hand trembled slightly before curling into a fist. I shouldn't have touched you. Albert turned away. You never had permission to touch anything of mine. Not my name, not my loyalty, and not my life. Keegan opened his mouth, closed it, and left without another word. The door slammed behind him. Albert stood there for a long time, with the echo of their fight ringing louder than the silence that followed. The next morning, the staff found the study in disarray. Books were scattered across the floor. A glass had shattered near the hearth, crimson wine soaking into the rug like blood. The heavy curtains had been torn slightly, one edge trailing the floor like a wounded flag. And yet, Albert sat in the high-backed chair near the window, ankles crossed, sipping tea. Calm, composed, unshaken. He looked up as the housekeeper entered. The wine was terrible, he said dryly. Tell the kitchen. She didn't answer. She just bowed and left him alone again. Something changed after that. Keegan didn't speak for 2 days, but he left the gate unlocked. It clicked open at dawn, the key still in the lock, like an unspoken question, like an offering. Albert didn't take it. He could have, he should have, but he stayed. And that, more than anything, rattled Keegan. Their first real conversation happened on a day when the sun managed to slip past the clouds and light the garden paths. Albert was reading in the courtyard. Keegan approached without armor, just a plain shirt and gloves. I thought you might like to walk, Keegan said. Albert didn't look up. Trying to bribe me into civility with fresh air? Keegan exhaled slowly. Trying to be decent. Albert turned the page. How unfamiliar for you. But he stood. They walked without speaking for a while. The path curved through dried rose bushes, a half-frozen pond, and a statue of a faceless goddess whose name had eroded with time. Finally, Albert said, You know, I had a brother. Keegan glanced over, startled. Albert's expression didn't change. He was younger, brilliant, terrible at lying. He thought he could fix things from the inside. A pause. He was taken during the palace purges. I never found his body, just his notebook. Pages torn out. Keegan's voice was low. I didn't know. No, Albert said quietly. You didn't care. Keegan stopped walking. Albert kept going. I still hear him, Albert continued, as if he hadn't noticed. When I'm dreaming, when I'm too tired to think straight. He tells me to keep fighting. He tells me not to forget. I'm sorry, Keegan said behind him. Albert turned. There was no triumph in his eyes, just something sad, hollow. I didn't tell you for an apology. Keegan nodded once, jaw tight. Then why? Albert met his gaze. Because someone should remember him. And if I die here, I want you to carry that weight. Keegan didn't speak again. They finished the walk in silence. That night, Albert found a folded blanket and a pillow outside his bedroom door. He blinked down at it, confused, until he noticed the shape behind the armchair beside the door. Keegan, sitting on the floor, back to the wall, legs stretched out. You're not sleeping in a bed? Albert asked softly. Keegan didn't open his eyes. Didn't think I'd earned it. Albert stood there for a moment, unsure whether to mock him or thank him. Instead, he opened the door and went inside. But that night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without waking from nightmares. Outside, Keegan remained on the cold stone floor, head resting back, listening for sounds that didn't come. Not a guard. Not anymore. Just a man. Trying to figure out what redemption cost, and whether it was already too late to pay. Chapter 3. What breaks isn't always what's weak. The estate gardens were finally thawing. The frost had receded from the hedges, and the dormant trees were beginning to show slivers of green. Spring didn't come quickly to the northern province, but it came eventually, dragging warmth behind it like a reluctant guest. Albert sat beneath the trellis near the rose beds, legs crossed, book balanced on his knee. He wasn't reading it. Not really. His eyes flicked more often toward the stone path than the page. Keegan hadn't shown up yet. For the past 2 weeks they had developed a rhythm, unspoken, quiet, cautious. Mornings in the library, afternoons in the garden. Keegan at a distance, never intruding, but always near enough that Albert could feel him like gravity. But today the silence was deeper, until footsteps broke it, heels, not boots. Albert looked up, brows lifting in surprise. Irina? His aunt swept toward him in a swirl of dark velvet and fur-lined sleeves, her silver hair braided intricately, sharp eyes narrowed with amusement. Still alive, I see. Albert rose quickly, setting the book aside. What are you doing here? Irina kissed both his cheeks with a calculated affection of nobility, then pulled back and smiled thinly. You think I'd let them bury you in the snow and forget about you? I came to inspect the wreckage. Her gaze drifted toward the manor, then over Albert's shoulder, to where Keegan had just emerged from the gate, his expression unreadable. Well, well, Irina murmured. The dog still has his leash. Keegan stopped 2 paces from them, spine straight, face tight. Lady Irina. Oh, don't look so stiff, she said, waving a gloved hand. You're not at court anymore. You're in exile, darling, just like him. Don't pretend you're not wearing the same shackles. Albert's mouth twitched, but he didn't defend Keegan. He didn't know if he wanted to. Keegan said nothing. His jaw locked once, then he turned and walked back toward the manor, fists clenched. Irina turned to Albert, amused. Hit a nerve? Albert exhaled. Several. I always liked you better with a little venom in your voice, she said. But be careful with him. Men like that don't have souls. They have orders. Albert found Keegan in the West Wing garden, pacing by the broken sundial. He didn't announce himself, just stood there until Keegan noticed him. She wasn't wrong, Keegan said quietly, voice without bite. I was a dog on a leash. Maybe I still am. Albert stepped closer. But I'm trying to break it now. Albert looked at him for a long moment. Then prove it. Keegan met his eyes. 1 hour. Outside the walls. No chains. Your rules. Albert blinked. You're letting me leave? I'm offering, Keegan corrected. There's a village 2 miles out. If anyone asks, I'm your hired sword. You're a merchant's son with a spoiled tongue. Albert tilted his head. And if I bolt? Keegan smiled faintly. Then I'll assume you wanted freedom more than anything else, and I'll let you go. That caught Albert off guard. No bluff, no threat, just trust. It was unnerving. They dressed in simple clothes, plain tunics, worn cloaks, a bit of dirt under their nails to pass for lower-class travelers. Albert wore a cloth mask pulled up over his mouth. Keegan wore a scarf, hood raised. The village was small, 2 winding streets, a marketplace, and a bell tower with a crooked spire. It smelled like bread and sheep and early spring mud. Albert marveled at the noise. The life! Children darting between stalls, vendors shouting over one another, a bard playing something off-key by the well. Keegan walked beside him, tense, hand never far from the dagger hidden in his coat. You're walking like a criminal, Albert muttered. I am a criminal, Keegan said, and so are you. Mine was noble treason. Yours was just silence. They bickered as they moved from stall to stall. Albert accused Keegan of lacking a moral compass. Keegan accused Albert of confusing martyrdom with arrogance. Albert picked a fight over the price of apples. Keegan tried to haggle with a baker and failed spectacularly. The rhythm was bitter, familiar, weirdly comfortable. Until Albert tripped over a child's toy and sent a basket of pears tumbling into the street. The vendor screamed. A pig bolted. 2 boys laughed until they fell over. Albert crouched to help, cursing. Keegan knelt beside him, snorting. Albert looked up. Are you laughing at me? Keegan nodded. With you. Albert stared for a second, then laughed too. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't sarcastic. It was real. It cracked something open in his chest. It didn't last. A voice cut through the crowd. Is that? Albert stiffened. The merchant at the honey stand was staring at him, eyes wide. Keegan reacted instantly, stepping between them. Move! But it was too late. The man grabbed a bell and rang it hard. Traitor! Crown traitor! Keegan shoved Albert behind him as the crowd stirred. 3 men moved toward them. Albert's breath caught. He hadn't brought a weapon. But Keegan didn't need help. He was a blur of force. blocking one punch, twisting another arm, sending a man sprawling into the mud. A dagger flashed. Someone screamed. Blood bloomed across a sleeve. Albert caught one man trying to grab him and shoved him backward with his whole body weight. His palms scraped hard against the cobblestones. Keegan grabbed him. "Time's up. Run." They fled through the alleys, breathing ragged, cloaks flying behind them like torn flags. Back at the manor, the gates slammed shut. Albert stumbled into the foyer, panting. "Well, that was charming." Keegan was already pulling off his cloak, jaw clenched. "Let me see your hand." Albert blinked. "It's fine." "Albert?" The way he said it, firm but not commanding, made Albert stop resisting. He held out his palm. Blood streaked the center, small cuts along the fingers. Keegan took it gently, inspecting it. "You'll live." His fingers brushed Albert's wrist as he cleaned it with a damp cloth. The touch lingered, soft, intentional. Albert didn't pull away. They said nothing. Keegan wrapped it carefully in linen, knotted it, then looked up and found Albert watching him. "Thank you," Albert said. Keegan swallowed. "For the pears?" Albert smiled faintly. "For everything else." That night, the manor was quiet again. But Albert's sleep was not. The nightmare started the same way it always did. Shouts, firelight, his brother screaming from the hallway, papers burning in the fireplace, Keegan standing in the doorway doing nothing. He woke with a sharp cry, drenched in sweat, heart hammering, and Keegan was there, sitting in the chair by the bed, not in armor, not alert, just there. Albert blinked, breathing hard. "You sleep here now?" Keegan looked at him, eyes soft in the darkness. "Sometimes." Albert shifted, sitting up, blanket pooling in his lap. "No." Albert rubbed at his face with his uninjured hand. "I dreamed of the fire again." Keegan nodded. "You talk in your sleep?" Albert looked over. "What do I say?" "His name," Keegan said quietly, "and mine." Albert's throat tightened. Keegan leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to fear me anymore." Albert met his gaze, and something broke open inside him, not violently, not like shattered glass, like a seal giving way to truth. "Maybe that's the problem," Albert said, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't." Chapter 4. The Undoing of the Strong. The morning mist curled around the stone pillars of the estate like silent spectators as Albert stood at the edge of the old training grounds, sleeves rolled up, bare forearms catching the pale sun. The dirt beneath his boots was dry, the ground scuffed from old memories of war and discipline. Keegan stood across from him, arms folded, watching with narrowed eyes. Albert straightened, tossed the practice dagger from one hand to the other, and said, "Don't go easy on me." Keegan arched a brow. "You haven't landed a hit yet." Albert grinned. "That's because you cheat." "You telegraph every move before you make it," Keegan replied, stepping forward. "You think with anger. That's useful in speeches, less so with blades." Albert's grin faded slightly. "I'm not learning this to kill." "I know. Then teach me like someone you don't expect to break." That caught Keegan off guard. Albert squared his shoulders. "So no one else ever gets to decide what I survive." Keegan didn't smile, but something shifted in his eyes. He reached out, took Albert's wrist gently, and began correcting his stance. "Then let's make sure they don't." The lessons became routine. Morning drills, evening stretches, occasional bruises. Their banter laced the air like smoke. Light, sharp, impossible to hold. "You're too stiff," Keegan said, circling him during one session. Albert huffed. "I'm trying not to look ridiculous." "You're succeeding at looking annoyed." Albert lunged, and this time he caught Keegan off guard. His palm struck Keegan's side. Not hard, but unexpected. The two froze. Then laughed. It was breathless, unguarded. Two men not on opposite sides of a war, but caught in something much stranger, something not yet named. Keegan brushed his hair back, exhaling. "You're improving." Albert smiled. "Maybe I'm just motivated." Keegan met his gaze and said nothing. He didn't have to. It was late afternoon when the estate gates creaked open, and a tall man with a weather-worn coat stepped through, boots kicking up dust. Albert spotted him from the second-floor balcony and immediately sensed the shift in the air. Keegan greeted the man near the training ground with a stiff, short embrace. "Captain Marius," Keegan muttered. Marius looked older than Keegan, gray at the temples, a scar on his lip, eyes like sharpened stone. "Didn't think I'd find you playing house with your prisoner." Keegan didn't react. "He's not a prisoner." "Oh, then what is he?" Marius glanced toward the balcony where Albert leaned against the rail, observing like a falcon. Keegan didn't answer. Marius laughed. You were sent here to keep him quiet, he said, louder now. Not fall in love with his damn backbone. Albert arched a brow. Keegan just muttered, "Shut up," but the damage was done. That night, Keegan lit the candles himself. The dining room was smaller than the formal hall, intimate, quiet. The fire in the hearth flickered low. The table was set for two, the food simple. Roasted vegetables, warm bread, and soft white cheese. Albert entered wearing a loose shirt, laces at the collar undone, collarbones exposed like invitation or challenge. Keegan had removed his belt and blade for the first time Albert could remember. He looked softer, younger, maybe, as if the weight he carried had loosened its grip for one evening. They sat across from each other. For a while, they simply ate in silence, the clinking of forks the only sound between them. Then Albert set his glass down and said, "What was he like, Marius?" Keegan took a sip of wine before answering. Gruff. Loyal. Once cut down 5 men to protect a child hiding under a cart. Then threw up after. Albert tilted his head. "You trust him." "I used to." "And now?" Keegan looked at him. "I'm learning what trust actually means." Albert's gaze flicked down. "That's new." "I think a lot of things are," Keegan said softly. The fire crackled. Albert leaned back, fingers tracing the stem of his glass. "You know, I used to lie awake thinking of all the ways I'd ruin you." Keegan didn't flinch. Albert went on, "Expose you, humiliate you, make you beg." Keegan's throat bobbed. Albert's voice softened. "But now I just want to know who you are when no one's watching." Keegan's hand drifted across the table. Just a brush, knuckles against the edge of Albert's fingers. It was a question. Albert didn't move away. Their hands barely touched. One of those moments that could be mistaken for accident but was too deliberate to be coincidence. Keegan leaned forward, eyes half-lidded, breath slow. His face tilted, inching closer. Albert's lips parted, but he placed 2 fingers gently against Keegan's mouth before they could touch. Keegan froze. "I want to kiss you," Albert whispered, voice like silk over thorns. "But not like this." Keegan pulled back slowly. "Not like what?" Albert's gaze held his. "Not while it still feels like a bruise." The silence was deep and kind. Keegan nodded once. "Then I'll wait." Albert smiled, small and real. Keegan's voice was lower now, almost hoarse. "Even if it kills me." Albert reached out and took his hand properly this time. No accidental brush, no caution. Just warmth. And something that might, someday, become love. Chapter 5. Mercy was never weakness. It began with the bells. Distant at first, faint echoes from the southern hills, carried by cold wind and the gulls that circled the estate towers. Albert looked up from the worn map he'd been studying in the library, the candlelight flickering against his features. His fingers paused over the ink-stained borders of the kingdom. The bells didn't stop. Keegan appeared in the doorway moments later. No armor, no blade, but the look on his face was enough. "He's dead," Keegan said. Albert stared. "The king?" Keegan nodded once. "Poisoned. The palace is in chaos. Word just arrived." Albert set the map aside with calm fingers and stood slowly, but inside something split. Not grief. Never that. Just the collapse of something that had loomed for too long. A crown rotting from the inside. And with the king's death came something else. No more exile. No more protection. Freedom, yes. But freedom laced with danger. Because power never stayed still for long. Lady Irina arrived the next morning, escorted by 2 guards and a horse draped in black mourning silks. She dismounted in a flurry of cold air and colder intentions. Albert met her at the gates, cloaked in charcoal gray, the wind lifting his curls from his face. "Have you come to weep at the grave of tyranny?" he asked dryly. Irina arched a brow. "I've come to drag my idiot nephew back to the throne room where he belongs." Inside, she warmed her hands by the fire and looked around with disdain. "This place smells like a soldier's quarters and unresolved sexual tension." Albert snorted. "I see exile hasn't dulled your diplomacy." She waved a hand. "Don't get clever. You're needed in the capital. I'm not a lord anymore. You were stripped of your title by a corpse. That corpse can't argue now." Albert looked toward the window. Keegan stood in the garden again, pacing near the training ring. Irina followed his gaze. "And what of him?" Albert didn't answer. She lowered her voice. "Men like Keegan are forged for service, not love. They obey until they crack, and when they do, they drag everything with them." Albert's jaw tightened. "He's not the same man." "Maybe. Or maybe he just hides better." She leaned closer. Don't forget who helped them take your voice. Albert turned away, but the seed had been planted. He found Keegan in the old cellar beneath the library, oil lamp in hand, brushing dust from a heavy iron latch in the floor. A tunnel, Keegan said. One of the old smuggling paths. It leads to the lower districts of the capital, if you need to return quietly. Albert stared at him. So you were expecting this? Keegan's shoulders lifted in a faint shrug. The king was a man of enemies. He made too many. Albert stepped into the light. You kept me here. You said it was for protection. Was that a lie? Keegan looked up. No. Albert's eyes narrowed. Then tell me this wasn't all to keep me silent, to soften me, to make me forget. Keegan set the lamp down. If it was, Albert said, voice cracking, then do it. End it. Chain me again. Put a blade to my throat. Just stop pretending you care. Keegan moved so suddenly it startled them both, dropping to his knees on the stone floor, the echo sharp. I kept you here because I thought I could control something. Anything. Because I was scared of what would happen if I let you be more than a mission. Albert swallowed hard but didn't speak. Keegan's voice broke. You were never the one who needed chains. I was. The lamp flickered between them. Albert stared down at him, at the man who had once stood at the king's right hand, who had watched him fall and hadn't spoken, who now knelt like he was the one condemned. Albert turned and walked away. But he didn't go far. They entered the capital by carriage 2 days later. No disguises, no shame. Albert wore his old house colors again, silver and black, the crest of a mountain rising over a fallen crown. Keegan rode beside him, silent, head slightly bowed. Not as a guard. Not anymore. As a shadow turned protector. As a man carrying his own ghosts. The city had changed in their absence. Power moved like smoke now, uncertain, rising, curling into strange shapes. Noble families circled like wolves. Whispers filled every corridor of the royal court. But when Albert walked into the great hall, he did not cower. He stood at the center of the council chamber, shoulders square, voice like tempered steel. I will not beg for my name back. I will take it. He named the king's crimes without flinching. He spoke of justice, of restoration, of memory. He did not ask for forgiveness. He demanded a reckoning. And through it all, Keegan stood just behind him, not once speaking, but never letting his gaze stray. Not until the final council vote passed, and a man in dark red robes rose from the shadows, a blade flashing in his sleeve. It happened too fast. Albert turned. The knife caught the corner of his sight. But Keegan was already moving. The blade never touched Albert. It sank into Keegan's side. Gasps rang through the chamber. Guards surged forward. The attacker was dragged down. Albert dropped to his knees as Keegan collapsed into him. Keegan, he breathed, catching him as blood soaked through fabric, hot and fast. No, look at me. Keegan winced, trying to stay upright. You always were. Dramatic. Albert choked a laugh, but his hands trembled. You're bleeding too much. Keegan's head dropped against his shoulder. Still waiting for that kiss. Albert blinked against the sting in his eyes. Don't you dare die before I tell you I forgive you. Keegan's hand curled around his wrist, weak but still there. Albert pressed their foreheads together. Don't you leave me again. Not like this. Keegan smiled faintly, blood at the edge of his mouth. Wasn't planning to. Albert gripped him tighter, and the council chamber for one breathless moment held still. Not in fear, not in mourning, but in witness. Chapter 6. Kiss me like it's a beginning. The wound had healed slower than expected. The blade had missed Keegan's heart, but barely. Weeks passed beneath gauze and grit, through bitter medicine and restless sleep. The scar on his shoulder was deep, a crooked line across hardened muscle, a mark he would wear for the rest of his life. But for the first time in years, Keegan carried something heavier than guilt, and somehow it felt lighter. Albert didn't leave his side. Not when the fever took hold. Not when Keegan cursed the world and tried to rise too early. Not even when the nightmares crept in, and he woke gasping for breath. Albert was always there. Silent some days, sharp-tongued others, but constant. And when the bandages came off, when Keegan could stand again without faltering, they returned to the estate. Together. The manor had changed in their absence. Warmth lingered now, fresh linens, open windows, laughter in the halls. Albert had taken control not just of his name, but of the land itself. The staff answered to him. The papers bore his seal. And still, he moved through the estate with the same grace he always had. Head high, eyes full of purpose, spine straight as if he carried not a legacy, but a promise. Keegan watched him from the garden that morning, the one beyond the training grounds, where violets had begun to bloom along the path. He stood near the stone archway, bare feet in the dew-soaked grass, unsure if he belonged there anymore. Not because Albert had pushed him away, but because Keegan still hadn't quite forgiven himself for all the ways he'd tried to control the man who now held the world so delicately in his hands. Footsteps approached behind him. Albert. He didn't say anything at first, just stopped beside him, looking out at the same horizon. Then he reached down slowly and threaded their fingers together. "I hated you," Albert said quietly, voice steady. "Then I mourned you, and now?" Keegan looked at him. Albert smiled faintly. "Now I choose you." Keegan's breath caught. He turned toward him fully, his free hand coming up to brush back a loose curl from Albert's forehead. Their eyes met, dark and green, heavy with memory, trembling with something new. Albert leaned in first. The kiss wasn't desperate. It was deep, slow, shaking. A kiss made of unspoken apologies and carefully rebuilt trust. A kiss that asked permission even after it had already been granted. When they pulled back, Keegan was breathless. "I'll never take you for granted again." Albert smirked, lips still inches from his. "Then prove it, every day." That night, the bedroom was warm with candlelight and softness. No armor hung on hooks, no locked doors. Just a fire in the hearth, silk sheets tangled at the foot of the bed, and two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a war they never wanted to fight. Albert tugged Keegan toward him by the hem of his shirt, eyes heavy-lidded, but not with lust alone, with want, with intention. Keegan cupped Albert's face, thumbs brushing over the skin just below his cheekbones. "You can stop me if you want." Albert leaned into his palm. "I won't." They undressed slowly, not with urgency, but with reverence. There was no hunger in it, only a quiet ache. An exploration. Keegan pressed kisses down Albert's throat, over his collarbone, across the curve of his shoulder, where no scars lived. Albert's hands dragged over Keegan's back, not to claim, but to learn. The mattress dipped beneath them, and they moved together, not to forget the pain they'd carried, but to finally let it go. Albert's lips trembled against Keegan's jaw as he whispered, "We were both broken." Keegan held him tighter, pressing their foreheads together, heart pounding against skin. "But somehow," Albert smiled against his mouth, "we fit now." Morning came gently. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden lines across the floorboards of the master bedroom. Keegan was the first to rise, shirtless, half asleep, hair mussed in a way Albert would tease him for later. He wandered into the kitchen barefoot, whistling under his breath, and promptly burned the eggs. Smoke curled up from the pan. "Damn it!" From the hallway, Albert's voice floated in. "Are you trying to start a fire or feed us?" Keegan grinned. "Would it be worse if I said both?" Albert appeared in the doorway, wrapped in Keegan's shirt, legs bare, eyes still hazy with sleep. He walked over, arms snaking around Keegan's waist from behind. "You're terrible at this," Albert murmured, kissing his shoulder. Keegan turned his head and kissed the top of his curls. "Good thing I'm good at other things." Albert laughed, pressing closer. And there, in the softest part of the morning, in a kitchen filled with smoke and laughter, they stood, two men who had once built walls around their hearts, now choosing to wake up beside each other. Not perfect, but finally free, finally equal, and finally home.